Well, we're getting just to about 5 minutes after, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. As folks come into the room, please just introduce yourself in the chat. Let's see here. Please include this info in your introduction, and I'll go ahead and get started. This is our EIJ session for the day. We're calling it Into the EIJ Multiverse, Going Beyond Diversity. So how we can move our conversations and our practices beyond an emphasis and focus on just diversifying our groups, diversifying our boards, and really explore what it means to center equity and inclusion in a pursuit of food justice. So my name is Dan Miller. I use she or they pronouns. I am the EIJ strategist for Slow Food USA, one of the many hats I've worn during my time with the team. And happy to be in this role, having also been a former chapter leader myself of the Urban San Diego group. So happy to be here today, leading some of this discussion and ideation. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to kick it off with an intimate icebreaker to give you time to connect with another slow food leader one-on-one. We'll really dive deep into the concept of EIJ beyond just conversations about diversity. We'll have a group therapy style session where you can bring some of the EIJ issues that you're seeing and facing in your groups to the table for some thought partnership and some troubleshooting. And then we will close it out for the day. This is the last session of the Leader Summit for today. So congrats, you've made it through. And I hope that everybody has just enough energy left to make it through this session, because I think it's going to be a good one. So as I mentioned, we want to give you some time to connect with another leader one-on-one. So we're going to break out into pairs for the next 15 minutes, give you a chance to introduce yourselves. And really what we would like you to spend this time connecting over is a reflection on a time when maybe you misunderstood something or had a miscommunication with someone. We'd like you to share about that experience with your partner, talk about how you wish it could have gone differently, and ultimately what you learned from that experience. So I know we've got some folks who are still just hopping on, so we're introducing ourselves in the chat, and we're getting ready to head into a breakout group where we're gonna reflect on times when we've had miscommunications and what we learned from those experiences. So Dion, if you could please get the breakout rooms ready, and we can start sending folks that way. All right, looks like everybody is back. I hope you all had a chance to connect a little bit more intimately with another leader and share an experience that may have otherwise been difficult to share in a group. Thank you all for participating. Oh, are you all still seeing my screen here? Okay, so as of January 22nd, January 22nd actually marks the 1-year passing of Vietnamese monk and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh. And I wanted to share his quote here on the philosophy of giving peace a chance. When we think about peace, I think it's probably conjures up connotations of nonviolence or even the absence of large-scale conflict. In peace building, in the peace building profession, we call this type of peace negative peace. The concept of positive peace is present when human and civil rights are fully realized and expressed in communities across the globe. Working toward food justice is our way as a network and an organization of helping realize a piece of positive peace. So in our work for food justice, we can all be peace builders. And I think that is sort of a really exciting way to frame up the work that we do. And in order to get there, in order to give that peace a chance to really come to fruition, we have to work together to remove tensions between traditions, between ways of thinking, ways of doing, ways of knowing, ways of being. And I think that's what our work and our journey of equity, inclusion, and justice at Slow Food USA is all about. So we have been here before. We have introduced knowledge, awareness, and skills at the 2020 Leader Summit as a means of helping cultivate our own cultural capacity, mainly through the framing of diversifying our board leadership. Now, diversifying board leadership is one of many steps, one of many initiatives that we can take as leaders. And so we want to give ourselves a chance to really go deeper, right? Take it beyond just that. How do I diversify my board? How do I diversify my chapter? That's a piece of it, but it certainly is not the beginning or the end. It's the beginning, but certainly not the end of our journey. Diversity is reality, and how that reality manifests depends on the context, situational context, historical context. When we talk about EIJ, what are we really talking about? It goes beyond what meets the eye, it goes beyond demographic information. So let's really dig in and demystify some of what all of this means together. So just as the universe ebbs and flows, we experience the foregrounding and the backgrounding of social issues and approaches to addressing those issues. In recent years, Slow Food USA has taken a more race-focused approach to understanding and addressing food system issues. This is partly because of the intertwining sort of barbed wires of colonization, land theft, and slavery, forced labor, that are each fortified around the social construct of race, right? Like our food system and the way our agricultural industry is set up here in the United States was based on land theft and forced labor. We also have the collective consciousness around issues of race, growing with things like the 2020 racial reckoning, where we see a lot of public coverage of police brutality against Black people, and the staggering disproportionate number of COVID deaths in communities of color, right? There are many ways that social identity issues can inform our work. For example, when women and gender issues and the rights of birthing people come into the forefront, those issues can come into the forefront, say, for example, when access to healthcare is being compromised or when bodily autonomy is under threat. So the salience, the attention and awareness that we're giving to any issue, particularly around social identity, is changing based on what we're hearing about, what we're learning about, what our experiences are. So how are we situating ourselves within that? One way we situate ourselves within that is by understanding how all of our identities intersect and align across dimensions. So it's really important to remember that identity is not a static or flat thing. It not only intersects, but it exists across all of these dimensions. And so just as identity is multidimensional, this is a wheel and representation of that I like to use because it's a little bit more dynamic than kind of the typical list of like target and agent identity groups. Just as identity is multidimensional, so do our approaches to equity inclusion, right? We need to make sure that we're being multidimensional in our approach. So we have to take it beyond necessarily just diversity, right? And how do we build diversity? Poses a really great question. A question that I think Slow Food USA team is interested in exploring. How do issues of identity intersect with food? And I think particularly one area we'd like to grow in is exploring, aside from race and ethnicity, because we know that food is a vessel for culture and for heritage, and we have so much race and ethnicity baked into our food. They're one and the same, right? A lot of times those cultural identities and those food identities overlapping. How do let's remain present with that exploration and also work to explore how other social identity categories intersect with food: gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, religion, ability. EIJ doesn't just mean diversifying a group, fulfilling a diversity quota, and it also doesn't just mean providing services to communities of concern, right? Communities are living and breathing. And when properly cultivating knowledge, awareness, and skills, our EIJ philosophy, our EIJ values can actually help provide a framework that enables us to safely and constructively foster connections that can give us a pulse on our communities, right? If communities are living and breathing, they have a pulse. What is that pulse? How can I, as a local slow food leader, keep that pulse? In what ways am I a part of that pulse? And what ways do I have a different pulse? I think these are all sort of great points on the map to kind of situate ourselves to. EIJ requires an embodied practice, right, where we're thinking critically and problem solving through a lens of cultural awareness and cultural humility. Yesterday during our programs session, Collis really spoke to the power of connecting over our values. I really loved hearing from Collis and his ideas around values and connecting over values. And the philosophy of connecting over values is a philosophy that's really central and foundational to the global slow food movement. I believe that our values of equity, inclusion, and justice are some of our strongest. I think we just need to keep exercising those muscles and find new ways to challenge ourselves and how we can grow in that area. These practices should be reflected in our policies and in the way that we self-govern, both formally and informally. And it's a chance for us as leaders in a large and changing network to make sure that our practices and philosophies are aligning with the policies and procedures that we often find ourselves needing to take on, to run a board, to stay compliant with the IRS, to host an event, to run programming, right? There's all policies and procedures that go along with all of that. EIJ gives us the framework for the philosophies and practices that we can bring to that to ensure that we're really embedding equity, inclusion, and justice in all that we do. So what are some ways that we're already doing this? What are some philosophies and practices that we already have as a group that really help us center EIJ in our work? One is exploring food as politics. Another is using gender pronouns. And last but certainly not least is a practice of land acknowledgement. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. So food as politics. We are not making food political. Food is political. Here is why. I think Anna said it best in her 2021 blog or newsletter address. That's talking about staying in the slow food lane. I think that had come from some feedback that slow food needs to stay out of politics and stay in its lane, when in fact slow food has always been political. When it began in Italy 30 years ago, it was activists and protests coming together to reject the establishment of the fast food industry in their community. So rallying against capitalism is very much one of the core values of slow food. Standing up for Black and Indigenous rights. When Slow Food International launched the Arc of Taste in 1997, they were making it clear that industrialization and conflict were threats to biodiversity. And here in the United States, as previously mentioned, a lot of our conflicts are rooted in slavery, rooted in Indigenous exploitation and racist food policies as a result of those systems. And this piece about justice being for all. Slow food, the food itself, the connections, the relationships, all of this is about joy. However, without the element of justice, this joy tends to translate into elitism and exclusivity. So trying to bring the two together, joy and justice, to coexist, a vision for the future that really helps us manifest that good, clean, and fair food for all piece, right? That for everybody. Using gender pronouns. So there are over 100 pronouns in the English language. And those vary from everything like personal pronouns, me, us, you, to possessive, mine, ours, yours. The list really goes on and on. And what we've been trying to do here at Slow Food USA is encourage folks to use gender pronouns. Using gender pronouns effectively helps us disrupt cycles of assuming or assigning someone's gender, which is a process that begins before birth. And gender communication is changing all the time. I studied gender communication in my undergraduate, and still find, and I feel like every single day since I graduated, I'm learning something new about the way that we can communicate about our gender. So this is just one of those ways that we can avoid assumptions and really honor someone's personal identity. We have to educate ourselves first. And I always give the offering of my own pronouns before I will ask someone how they'd like to be referred to. It's always an invitation and never an insistence. You're not asking somebody about their gender identity. You're asking them how they would like to be referred to and how they'd like to be related to. If we make a mistake, we have to be willing to acknowledge it, apologize if we need to, and know that mistakes will happen. Gender identity is fluid and may change. We just need to stay present with our impacts and learn from that. And I think those are all things that we're really working to do here at Slow Food USA. I'm next going to share some tips from a guide to Indigenous land acknowledgement from the Native Governance Center. I really appreciate this insight from Mary Lyons. And so want to just kind of consolidate some tips on helping us all build an active land acknowledgement practice. A land acknowledgement is not something that you Google once and never revisit again. There are ways to build an active practice. And here are some key components of helping build that active practice. Again, some of which I think we already embody really well here in our network. Before you begin, ask yourself, why are you doing this? Why, what is sort of your end goal? Beyond just identifying the Indigenous people to whom the land belongs, also explore the history of the land and related treaties. Take the time to learn the names of Indigenous people currently living from these communities. Include, give yourself time to learn about the places as well as the language, and really strive for correct pronunciation. Speaking of language, I think it's important to be specific in our language. We really shouldn't be sugarcoating the past when we're referring to historical events. And along that note, this is an issue of past, present, and future. Indigenous folks, communities are still here and thriving, and a land acknowledgement should not treat our Indigenous brothers and sisters as relics of the past. A good land acknowledgement is one that focuses on the positivity of who Indigenous folks are today. So here are just a list of some of those key components. And taking action, right? We're talking about building an active practice, and it goes far beyond, just the verbal or written land acknowledgement itself. It looks like supporting Indigenous organizations, supporting Indigenous-led movements and campaigns, encouraging others to do so, committing to returning land, right? And going back to my previous point about having a pulse in the community, being connected to Indigenous leadership and community in your community so that you know what their goals are. How can you use your resources, your voice, mobilize your community around supporting those initiatives that have already been self-identified by the community? So what are some opportunities for growth? I wanted to highlight some areas that I think we as a network and organization have some ways to go and room to really improve the way that we're seeking to embody our values of equity, inclusion, and justice. And the first is leaning into conflict. We all are working in groups. Conflict is a natural part of groups, and with the right tools and skills and boundaries, conflict can be generative. we are in an organization where we really need to focus on negotiating the balance between purpose and belonging, right? When I say that, I mean, we come to this organization, we come to this mission of good, clean, and fair food for all, and we find a lot of purpose in that. We find a lot of meaning. We build a lot of connections. The belonging piece can sometimes be at odds with the purpose, right? And that's just because we show up as who we are, and we show up wanting to be accepted, wanting to be valued, and wanting to be able to leverage our power and power each other up in service of a common goal. Sometimes there's tension here, or sometimes it doesn't look the way that we think it should look. Being able to balance purpose and belonging are going to continue to be sort of crucial elements to movement building. So how can we do that? How can we lean into that opportunity? Navigating differences, navigating rank, right? We really try to encourage a distributed and sort of lateral leadership model in Slow Food USA. And there are folks who still will need to have more of a leadership role. There are times when other folks' voices might be a little bit louder. There may be times when you as a group are struggling to figure out sort of which spectrums you need to navigate in order to be effective in your work. Leaning into those conversations and giving ourselves the chance to unpack that is crucial for helping conflict be productive. Practicing direct feedback and accountability. It's hard to be accountable if we don't know what we're doing wrong, if we don't know how we've harmed someone, if we're unaware of how our actions are having an impact. So creating those opportunities to provide feedback to each other and being accountable to that feedback. And most importantly, building healthy containers. We talk about this a lot, about building healthy relationships, building strong chapters, building strong communities. So when the container that you're building is healthy, conflict can bounce around in there and be held and help us end up in a productive place. So exploring the ways that we can turn conflict into a tool, I think is crucial for us. And I'd like to see us exercising that muscle a little bit more as a network and as an org. Unpacking cultural blindness. This is an epistemological inquiry, right? We don't know what we don't know. That's also not an excuse. We have to be willing to facilitate experiences and learning opportunities that help us shine light on those cultural blind spots. How can we unpack different ways of knowing and really challenge ourselves to move in a new direction and be comfortable with the discomfort of having to learn and head in a different direction? And last but certainly not least, building long-term partnerships. Justice is communal. It really takes all of us acting with some kind of alignment across organizations and networks. And justice is so big and so communal that it can't just be the slow food community, right? We have to figure out how to be in meaningful, strategic, long-term partnerships that really help us fulfill that goal of joy and justice, that goal of good, clean, and fair food for all. So these are some of the muscles that I'd like to see us exercise. We'll be developing items, toolkit items for sort of each of these 3 plus other items that you all have contributed feedback on. But just to kind of map out what we've traditionally been good at and what we would like to be better at moving forward. So all of this to sort of get to our driving question of what does it look like to move beyond diversity? And what I'd like to do during this time is invite us to sort of reframe some of the questions that we've been asking ourselves, some of the questions we receive from you all as leaders, some of the questions I know you all ask each other as leaders, and just kind of give a reframing that helps us move beyond just focusing on diversity. So rather than asking the question of how do I diversify my board, a question we might ask is, how can we as a slow food group working towards good, clean, and fair food for all be in reciprocal relationship with other local organizations and actors who have a similar mission and vision, right? One way I've put this is, we are a volunteer-led organization. From an economic standpoint, it makes sense that folks from communities of concern don't have the time, resources, or capacity to volunteer. However, they might already be doing that work in their day-to-day. So can you, as a board leader, seek a partnership or a relationship with an organization, maybe that has more of a racial justice focus, maybe that is led by our Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and work with them in that capacity, right? Rather than necessarily feeling like we need to take individual leaders and elevate them into slow food board leadership, right? This is how we build solidarity and how we build equity. Another way to look at that question might be, how do we build partnerships with mission-aligned community groups and organizations, really focusing on community-centric and community-led organizations. Another common question that we can reframe is, how can we tell diverse stories? And rather than how do we tell diverse stories, maybe what we could explore instead is, how can we embody cultural exchange in a story creation process? Last year, myself, our communication director, Brian, and then communication coordinator, Michelle, worked together on a resource framework for cultural exchange for storytellers that really talks about, what does it mean to center cultural exchange? What does it mean to center relationships when we're trying to tell a story? Typical traditional storytelling can be rather extractive, interview style, getting information, getting it into a blog and sending it out. How do we put the relationship first and the content second? That's really what cultural exchange is about. So we've dropped that resource into the chat, and I hope you all will spend some time with it, because I think there's some really powerful framings regarding power and how power shows up in our relationships, in our stories, and how we not just be person first, but also give ourselves an opportunity to reflect on how implicit bias may be showing up and impacting how we're telling a story. What are really the roles within a story creation process? All of that. And one more kind of framing or one more sort of question or issue that we get raised sometimes. I feel like a little bit less now during my time at Slow Food USA, but maybe a little bit more before my time, is like, we don't have any issues with, and then like fill in the blank. We don't have any issues with diversity. We don't have any issues with racism. We don't have any issues with, like I said, fill in the blank there with whatever sort of challenge. And my there are lots of issues, and it's the nature of privilege and implicit bias and power imbalance to not see where issues are, right? That goes back to that cultural blindness piece. We don't know what we don't know. But rather than saying we don't have this issue, how a better framing might be, how is equity, inclusion, and justice showing up or not showing up in our work? Or how have we mobilized our community around this issue? If you're saying that you've already solved and addressed a problem, there are some really big lessons there that y'all should be sharing, because we would love to know if you've solved racism. Please let us know. We would love to take some notes and share it out. I'm being quite facetious, but what is if you feel like you're not having an issue, is it really a success that we can all learn from, or is it actually just a piece of cultural blindness that we need to unpack a little bit more? I want to share an example that just came up recently of to kind of answer that question of how are we mobilizing in our communities. So I had a chapter leader reach out from the El Paso area about some harassment and terrorizing of Black ranchers in that area who were having being harassed regularly by neighbors as well as law enforcement. I mean, harassment is putting it lightly. I mean, it's full on racialized terror, essentially. And this leader reached out to myself and to our communication staff to say, hey, here's an issue that's happening in the community. As a slow food group, we would like to show our support and get involved. You know, what kind of guidance can you provide? And that was a great opportunity. One, they were recognizing an issue, right? They took that pulse. I'm going to keep going back to this idea of communities being living and breathing and having a pulse. They took that pulse, recognized an opportunity for them as a group to intervene, and then they asked for guidance, right? Like they sought additional support in how can we support the cause of these farmers, send out a petition, gather folks to head out to a rally at the Capitol in support of this family. And this was from some chapter leaders getting together and talking about, hey, this is a real issue of race happening in our community. How can we help? So I know sometimes it feels like a lot of our equity, inclusion, and justice work is internally focused, right? Again, that's because we're trying to build our practices and we're trying to build our philosophies. And there are also ways that we have to make sure we don't get too sucked in to just the dynamics of what's happening internally and keep that external pulse and understand how we as leaders can intervene, can mobilize. So enough for me. What we're gonna do now is actually spend the next 30 minutes or so. I think we've timed it right. Okay, I'm seeing that. Okay, thanks, Dion. The next 30 minutes or so in some self-guided breakout groups. That's kind of meant to be like a little bit of small group therapy. We really want you to come with some issues around EIJ that you're experiencing in your groups, in your communities, maybe even in your work outside of slow food, if it's slow food related. Really thinking about not slow food as the organization and the boards and the groups, but the slow food as the movement and everybody who comes together to do good, clean, and fair food for all, right? Even if they're not under the snail and within the brand, so to speak. And really dive into that question of what issues of equity and inclusion are showing up in your pursuit of food justice. So the two driving, there's sort of two ways that you can take a look at this. You can share about some of the EIJ challenges that you've had and ask your group for help in brainstorming what kind of resources are needed to help address those challenges. Or we could do more of an asset-based focus, which would mean talking about your EIJ successes, right? Like what have sort of been some ways, some successes around equity inclusion in your pursuit of food justice, and sort of taking it a step further and trying to pinpoint what skills and strengths aided in that successful outcome, right? This is where we get into helping resource each other as peers and helping collectively brainstorm and troubleshoot as peers. So without further ado, we will open up our breakout groups. I think there'll be probably about 3 of you in each group.
I think the math worked out to have about 4.
Oh, okay, great. So there'll be about 4 of you in a group. We'll post the reflection questions in the chat so you have them. So EIJ challenges, successes, resources needed, or skills and strengths used. And if you want a 5-minute bio break before your group dives in, please take that 5-minute break, maybe think about what you want to chat with your group about, and then make sure that you get started within the first 5 minutes, because you'll have about 15 minutes to all chat with each other. I'll check in and see how it's going if you need more time. And then we'll come back for a 10-minute debrief before we close out for the session. I can't believe it's already that time. So let's head into our breakout groups.
I just want to make sure before we split off, are there any questions? I know we talked a lot about, kind of ran the gamut of EIJ, but just wanted to see if there are any questions that were popped up or any concerns or any immediate thoughts before we split up into our respective groups.
Okay. There we go. Welcome back. Sorry if the transition felt a little abrupt. We could always use more time. I want to give us a little bit of time to kind of debrief and hear a little bit about how it was going. I think we had 2 main rooms happening. So would love for folks to drop in the chat, come off mute, use the raise hand feature, and just talk a little bit about what was coming up for you all in your group. Themes, insights, maybe someone had a sharing that particularly resonated with you. Would love to spend a little bit of time unpacking that. And then also include if you talked about sort of action items or next steps, if you were talking about sort of like an issue or a challenge and how you might address it, or maybe you're kind of at you were talking about an issue that had a roadblock. Let's open it up to talk a little bit about what that block was. And for the group that wasn't able to finish your discussion, if you want to kind of tie in trying to finish that up a little bit to your share back, please do. But yeah, would love to hear from folks. What's going on in the EIJ multiverse? Yeah, Dion, go ahead.
I'd love to I attempted to frantically keep the rooms open, sorry. But I'll give a small synopsis, and if John, if you're okay with it, to sum it up and to open up the discussion a bit more to the group. I think you're muted. I don't know if I could lip read yes, that's okay or not. Okay, it's a thumbs up. Okay, amazing. So John is there's a member of his community that is a person of color and is super active in the community and also a little bit divisive. But the conversation that that person had with John is that I want to basically break down the establishment and use the term till all of the power is black, like a black power sort of moment for slow food, and that to direct and drive leadership. And what should we do about what does John do about that in response? And he's discussed it with some of his board, and one of his board members is going to reach out to that person and talk to them about it. And there's been some back and forth saying oh, I don't know if I want to be on the board if this is the direction that it's going to go. And had some really great insights from Melanie as well as Shirley. Melanie was listening to a podcast or on the radio the other day about a discussion about power and the term, I guess the power that the term power brings, especially in this context. And please jump in, Melanie, if I'm going wayward, but the idea of how do we as slow food, or maybe even other organizations, how do we elicit that connotation that power brings without actually using that term? Because at least personally, I think that there is an oppressive connotation to that. And if that exists, then maybe we do need to call it out. But in terms of is there another way to go about it? And that's one question. And the second question, more specifically to John's case, is what does this individual in the community that could be a really useful ally and partner and person to bring into a network, what do they bring to the table? And I missed the last bit of that conversation, but I'm thinking, like, is it worth having that person within the network? Charlotte, please, you can patch up the last half of that thought process because I jumped out. If you'd like.
That was a good summary. I was trying to just share my experience because it's been a really tough tough issue to navigate. This guy who I've known for years, and we've done some partnering with some of the work he's done in the community. He's done a lot of urban farm creation and has done some really good work, but has alienated a lot of people with his language. But I've been really interested in staying, keeping a relationship, and even having him, we've met a couple times in the last year at one of his farm projects and seeing how he can plug into the organization, because I've really tried in the last year to as we're trying to reestablish our board, to very, very purposeful and really trying to change the nature and the makeup of our board, and do some other trying to grow the diversity and such. But it's been hard, and it's been alienating for other folks that are new to the organization as well, and not wanting to be part of it. And there's another woman, she's a Black woman who's doing some amazing work with Edna Lewis and some things, and is a joy and delight on the board. And we chatted at our last board meeting because this guy had sent a message to the whole board saying, basically, like, I want to know if the white people are going to give up the power, because I can't align myself, and I don't want to spend my time in an organization that's not going to be open to a power shift. Using that kind of, like, a lot of language around power. And my response to him and to everyone, because he had sent this open email to the whole group, was, I'm like, it's not about power in my mind. I mean, we're open to people doing good work and everyone having a seat at the table and working throughout the community. And the people that come to the table and are doing the work will have a voice in how the organization moves forward. But it's just been weird. I've been having a really, really hard time navigating this. It's been very it's kept me up at night. Sorry, that's kind of a little more. If anyone has any thoughts, great.
I had to hop on another device. Can you all hear me? Okay. I had to hop in on another device. Let me turn the camera off here, and then I can just, okay. I really thank you for bringing, for sharing the context and the story there, because there's a lot to unpack, right? It's like a divisive individual who could potentially be a great ally, but isn't necessarily showing up to the space that way. Conversations about power, the way we talk about it, and even like the way that we use that word, and also how that's showing up in the space. So there's a couple layers here. One, we really need to, I encourage everybody to kind of, just because something is coming, just because a thought or an idea or a belief is coming from a person of color, and we're seeking to elevate voices of color, doesn't always mean that that individual is right or justified in maybe the way that they want to approach something. At the same time, there's a great reflection opportunity for, am I uncomfortable with the concept of sharing power
Or am I uncomfortable with the way that power is being talked about? Am I uncomfortable with the words that are being used? Am I uncomfortable? Am I challenged in some way to take on another way of framing an issue or thinking about an issue? And like, both can be true, right? Like, we can hold space for the complexity of, I think the idea is right, but maybe the way it's being communicated and the way that this individual is showing up doesn't vibe, doesn't gel. And it can also be that curiosity is a really powerful tool here. Asking them to unpack a little bit about what they mean, right? When they come in and ask, are you willing to share power? Are you willing to shift? Are you willing to change? Ask them, do you have ideas about what that means? Do you have ideas about what that might look like here? How do we end up in a more collaborative space as a result of going down the path that you're suggesting? So one, we don't just have to take something that someone says because they belong to a certain identity group, but two, we also need to give ourselves the opportunity to reflect and really unpack what could be there underneath the surface, right? And then the third, not necessarily the third piece, but another piece of this is like, how do we shift power and address power without maybe using that terminology? We always have the opportunity as a group to create our own meaning, to develop our own shared language and vocabulary about how we want to talk about something. So if we need to develop a different way of talking about something so that we can digest it, I think that's okay, as long as we understand that folks who are not a part of that group are still going to be talking about it as power, that they're still going to be using other language that maybe we haven't decided upon as a group, is healthy for us to help navigate what the situation is. And this is not to be excused for, we don't want to talk about hard things, right? It's just, we need a different way of approaching this so that we can come out on the other side better together as a group with a better understanding sort of what's happening. I'm not saying all of that will solve all of your issues, but, and maybe you've already done some of that, right? Maybe you've already asked yourself some of those, reflected on some of the questions that I've provided and visited some of those inflection points, but at least there's a start. And curiosity, I think, is really what we can lead with here. I'm wondering if anybody else has any other reflections or insights that they would like to share. I also want to note that we only have a few minutes left.
Yeah, I didn't want to monopolize the whole thing with my
no,
my
that's
superior,
okay.
but
It's a real thing.
I appreciate what you and Melanie and some other folks have had to say. It's been really helpful. And I've done some of those things. I'm trying to make space to have some of those conversations with this individual, but he hasn't come to any of the meetings, so it's been hard to, without sitting down. I don't want to have the conversation over email in a way that's, it's just hard to navigate.
Yeah, it's also important to note the cultural differences that are showing up. I have folks who I work with, community organizers, who I know it's not gonna, the best way for me to connect is gonna be to pick up the phone and call them, right? It's not gonna be a text, it's not gonna be an email. I have to change maybe my preferred way of communicating in order to establish that line of connection before we can go into deeper conversation. So it sounds like maybe you're doing some of that exploration, maybe of like what kind of communication will be helpful to advancing your common goals. And we also have to be aware of the way that cultural differences are showing up in the way that we communicate with one another and exchange our ideas too, right? I want to put a pin in this, and I would love to connect more, John, offline and chat about this. I'm wondering what I want to do is give us a closing, and then if folks want to stay on past time, I am happy to stay on and answer more questions and receive more of your insights. Denisa, would you like to share?
Yeah, hi everyone. I just have a comment as we think about diversity of, what our brother John is, talking about, but also what people are going through, is really trying to see the perspectives and experiences that folks have been through. I mean, this pandemic has really brought a lot of grief and pain, trauma, suffering, loss, so much. And it's coming out even more exponentially, through voices and through exchange and through, collaborations. And whether it's a blessing or whether it's, through difficulties or challenges, whatever that may be. And I think part of the experience of all this and what you have said, Dan, is, trying some other alternative ways to communicate, but also knowing that when we do communicate, we're also looking to see, what healing modalities are possible, because we don't know what people have, where that they are speaking from this experience deep down, they've been hurt somewhere, some aspect, and trying to find, what's a healing modality, what's a healing perspective and action that, it may not even be talking. It may just be serving food. We do a lot of that, just like cooking a meal for someone, taking it to their home, or, reaching out and, saying, do you have any needs? Because there is something, that is delegating and controlling this type of environment or situation. And I just want to speak to seeing that in a very spiritual aspect, where there's much more behind the scenes of what we don't see, right? Or what is not shown. And getting to that point, that critical point of putting that pin there where it may pierce, that bubble to burst, is doing it by a healing action. And this takes a lot of love and joy, because we all don't want to be, in those types of situations, but we do have all of each other to help, to do something that will uplift someone and break that, whatever challenge it may be. And the beautiful thing about having these relationships with one another here, but also in our communities, is that we're able to do that when we have that support and just, encouraging one another day by day and step by step. And so just wanted to put that out there. And one thing is that I've learned is that one of the most revolutionary acts is just to be yourself. And sometimes we're like, how do we put this framework on that? How do we put this, apply this to this? But, grandpa showed us, our parents have shown us, how to love each other and how to care for one another. So just want to share that with you all. Thanks.
That's really beautiful, Denise. So thank you so much for bringing in the that framework of healing and seeking to understand, and the ancestral wisdom that we can bring into the space. I really appreciate that. I'm going to come over to you, Melanie, in just 1 second. I did want to drop a couple reminders, and then, like I said, I'm here to stay on, and if you want to stay on past time, you're welcome to as well. Our next BPOC Affinity Group meeting is happening on Wednesday, February 22nd at 2 p.m. PT, 5 p.m. ET. For all of our community members who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, please join us. And for any EIJ questions, concerns, comments, explorations, please feel free to reach out, dan@slowfoodusa.org. Someone will, I've lost all of my features on Zoom, so I'm going to trust one of my teammates to make sure that the exit survey for this event gets posted. Thank you, Dion. And that is, yeah, we've hit time, but like I said, this is really great conversation and insights and reflections in community. So I'm here to keep it going. Whoever else wants to say, please do. Melanie, take it away.
Oh, I'll keep this short and hopefully sweet. But yeah, no, this is a wonderful conversation. Obviously, these conversations take more time, and that's a process, but this is definitely part of it. So I appreciate, John, you sharing this experience with us, because it's a real world situation that we can converse about and discuss and kind of provide feedback to and forth with each other. But I was just gonna say, you know, as one potential way to interact with this person, or, you know, what are some possible ways in which you can move forward in the conversation with them, is first and foremost, really a reiteration of what Denise has said too, is to just acknowledge that you understand what they're saying, or that you at least acknowledge what they're saying. You recognize you know, the importance of what they're saying, and are willing to work, you know, together with them within the structure that you all have to make that possible, to make it more equitable. And I think that, you know, who can say no to that? Right? That's all. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Melanie. Yeah, how are we listening to understand? Are we listening to connect? How are we showing up with our listening, and we're also showing up with our own stuff, right? So how do we hold space for all of that? How do we cultivate those skills of holding space for others? Really appreciate that insight and that reflection. And always more time. Yes, more ___ more time to really dive into this kind of stuff. Anyone else want to share an insight or a reflection, a sharing from the group? I also cannot really see very many of you with my tech issues. So if anyone's like, the life force has drained out of their face and we need to wrap it up, somebody give me the sign. Shirley, I can see your hand, yay.
I just wanted to say really quickly that I think what Melanie and Denise said they're spot on, and I really appreciate their comments. But I just want to say, as my own personal experience and as a person of color, people come to situations with a lifetime of hurt, of pain. And if you can with your words move past or get to know that person, and I think you do know that person, Joe, because you or not Joe, I'm sorry. I think you've talked to that person several times, but I just want people to acknowledge that pain that people come to situations like this with. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. Yes, sometimes our pain is leading us, and sometimes the pain is so immense that it is in the room before even we are. So from that energetic perspective, how do we leave room for that and still see that person for their humanity beyond that pain that is radiating so immensely? Because that pain can come fast and furious, right? Thank you, Shirley. That's really beautiful. That's really beautiful. I see Joe had his hand, and then and then we'll kick it over to, is it Shola or Shala? I don't think I've met you before, but Joe, let's be good to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll come from the other side of the brain, but two comments. Decades ago, as a young assistant professor, one of my colleagues who taught from the communications department said, all communication is receiver based. If the speaker has marbles in his mouth, his or her mouth, or the listener has wax in his or her ears, it doesn't really matter. If the listener, the receiver, does not hear it, it doesn't really matter. It didn't happen, and so forth. So it's got to be received by the person, and so forth, who wants to hear it and does hear it. Second thing is I'm very active as far as combating mis and disinformation, particularly around scientific issues, climate, healthcare, COVID, and things like that, and so forth. And one technique that I found from the American Physical Society is called reflective listening. And I just put a few words in the chat. I don't have a link for that, but it is, if you're trying to combat COVID, mis and disinformation, or climate mis and disinformation, or tax policy, or whatever it is, reflective listening is one technique that can be useful for getting information across or correcting misperceptions about subjects where there really should be facts, are really what we're looking at, and so forth. So I'll just throw that out. But thanks for everything else that was said. I agree with everything.
Yeah, reflective listening. Ooh. Can you all hear me? Sorry, it's like echoing on my screen. Is it echoing now? Okay.
No, you're good. And I
Okay.
I put a definition. I found a definition online of it, so I put that in the chat.
Reflective listening, right? Yeah, I know reflective listening also to be about seeking to understand, being able to reflect back. One resource that we've encouraged folks to lean into before is The Art of Listening from Lee Moon Hwa, which tries to tie in some of the other ways that we communicate aside from just verbally. And I want to take a minute and just acknowledge that, yes, the intellectual and scientific way of listening and knowing certainly is present. And I think one of the beauties about the slow food space, because there is so much deeply spiritual and energetic work to food and aspects of food, is that we can call in those other ways of knowing too, right? Not just the intellectual and the logical, but we get into our intuitive intelligence, right? The intelligence of intimacy and connection and relationships, the knowledge of creativity. There's all these different ways that we can know and seek to understand. And all of those are present within us at any given time. So thank you for the resource on reflective listening, reflective communication. Really appreciate that, Joe. And Shala, if you could correct me on your name, that would be great, and would be awesome to hear from you.
It's Shala. Thank you for asking. Hey, John. I just wanted to say, both as a person of color who has occupied a spicy position in my life, and also as a person who I'm the daughter of a woman who has worked in racial reconciliation for longer than I have been alive, I just want to say it's kind of like food, right? Like a dish can be spicy, but does it still nourish you? Does it still taste good? And so as far as continuing the relationship with this person who presented you with a spicy dish, does it still nourish you? Does it still taste good? And I think that is really important to keep in mind, because just because, the dish is spicy doesn't mean it's not beneficial. And there are times when it isn't, right? Like sometimes they're too hot, or sometimes they're too hot for a particular time in a particular space. But yeah, as far as whether or not we want to continue to maintain relationships with people who present us with a spicy dish, does it taste good? Does it nourish you? So that's it.
Brilliant. The layers of that analogy. You started with saying spicy position and then took it into just a really beautiful, that's just so thoughtful. And as someone who loves spicy food, let me just say, amazing. Thank you so much for bringing that wisdom into the space. Really, really amazing insight on there's a just to kind of extend off of that, is it nourishing, right? Is it still nourishing? Even though it's spicy, is it still nourishing? And I think we can even think about, like, if it is still nourishing, then the question becomes, how are we going to adapt to include, to invite in, to make space? So I really love that inflection point of, it's spicy, is it still nourishing? Both of those can be true. It can be spicy and can be nourishing, right? And then if that's the case, how are we gonna change how can I change? How do I change my leadership? How does the group change its dynamics? How are we willing to adapt to that diversity, that difference? That question of how are we willing to change, to make room and space for that? I think those are really big questions that we can ask ourselves as leaders within this movement. Is the spice good, clean, and fair? Yes, I love it. I love it. I mean, we just can't pass up the analogies of food, right? It's like, it's not going to be lost on us. Any other insights, reflections, contributions? I really love how we've taken sort of this one context and all contributed something really beautiful to it. I think that mosaic making process is one of the most valuable processes that we can have. Anybody else have something they want to add to the mosaic, or maybe something else that they want to share?
Great facilitation, Dan.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Despite my tech issues, I think it's still panning out.
the conversation definitely needs to happen, part 2.
Yes,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
That missed out. Those of you that missed out, you missed out.
Yeah, we'll continue part 2, and I would love to continue it sooner rather than later. We'll definitely have another EIJ focus session at will it be a fall leader summit, Dion? There'll be a fall leader summit. We'll definitely have some EIJ conversations there, but I would love to keep on this energy. Speaking of energies, I would love to keep this energy going, because you're right, it's so rich. It's rich and it's spicy and it's all the things, right? Okay. Thank you all so much for your time, your talent, your willingness to dive in and explore things together. Really appreciate each and every one of you. And that concludes our programming for today. Tomorrow, Dion, I will go ahead and kick it over to you to talk a little bit about what's on the docket tomorrow.
Yeah, you might have seen Brian on this call earlier, but he will be leading a communication session tomorrow, alongside Micaiah, who is part of the comms team. So that'll kick off the day, and then we'll wrap up the day with fundraising with Patricia Hennessy, who leads development with Slow Food USA, and talking about funds and friends. So we'll see you all tomorrow from 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it should wrap up around 3:30 Eastern Standard Time. So yeah, excited to see you all there for the last day of the Leader Summit.
Thanks all for a great conversation today.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Peace.
See you.